Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hey folks, welcome back to the show. This is your host, Pat Flynn. Let's see where tonight's conversation goes, shall we? I've got a number of things on my mind. I've had a number of conversations with people lately that have been extremely fascinating, at times frustrating, but always fascinating, always always a good time when you get into some good old-fashioned religious argument, as I have quite often these past couple of weeks. So I want to share a bit of what I've learned from those conversations, maybe give you some ideas on how to best. Again, we keep coming back to this, how to best evangelize, how to best defend and share the Christian and Catholic faith. I'm actually giving a talk to a group not too long from now on apologetics. And the first part of that talk will very much involve why apologetics is necessary. And I take a step further than that. I don't say that it's just necessary. Apologetics is inevitable. At some point, somebody is going to ask you about your religious beliefs, and you're either going to have good answers for them or you're not. So even if you aren't the most zealous evangelist, even if you're not going on debate stages with people, apologetics is just, and when I say apologetics, I don't mean you're saying sorry for something. It means offering reasons for, or more specifically, a defense of a position that you hold to be true. In this case, Christian faith, the Catholic faith. So many of you know that I am a fairly ardent apologist, and so I'll be giving a speech to mostly young professionals in the Catholic world. That speech will likely turn into a series if I do a good job. They said that they want to invite me back on why apologetics is not only necessary but rewarding. When you make the exercise to defend and explain the faith to others, it helps you to better understand, comprehend, and appreciate the faith yourself. So there is a very rewarding, aside from the reward of actually bringing somebody into the faith, which is just, few things in life are as rewarding as helping somebody to become baptized or come back to the church or get confirmed. I mean, such an amazing experience that is when you bring somebody into the church. But even for you personally, when you go to evangelize and you study the doctrine, you study the history of the church, you study the philosophical arguments for God, what an amazing appreciation this gives you and how it strengthens your own conviction. So I would just say that even though I often engage in frustrating conversations with people who might initially be extremely closed-minded or emotionally positioned against church or religion, you keep trying to crack that nut. You keep trying to try and work your way in however you can. And the last little bit of advice I'll give here before we get into the conversation for any of you apologists out there, and I literally had this talk today with a friend of mine, is to always remember that you can win arguments but lose souls. Okay? So, it's not always that difficult, especially if you are pretty well-versed in the Catholic faith and you've been doing this a while. It's not often to best somebody in argumentation, but you have to be mindful that you're not souring somebody over you or over what the church is about. You have to be mindful of how you present your arguments. Now, you do need arguments. Everybody needs arguments because you're going to be asked for reasons why you believe the things that you do. And to give an argument is simply to present a reason for why you believe the things that you do. That's what an argument is in philosophy. We're not talking about like bickering with your wife or husband or whatever. Husband or wife. It's just two, folks. There's only two genders. I can't believe we even need to have this conversation, which is actually one of the conversations I had recently, but we'll get into that maybe soon. Eventually, at some point. Where do I want to start the talk tonight? Well, I actually started teaching Sunday school. We just had our first Sunday school And I don't mean Sunday school, the podcast I do. I mean actual Sunday school. Prep. I'm a catechist now. Go figure. So I have fourth graders. And boy, was this a joy. This was just an absolute joy. I'll admit, look, I've been teaching for the majority of my life. I have been teaching in some degree, either music or martial arts or business or writing or fitness. I've taught so many things, or religion or philosophy. But I never really taught in a classroom format to fourth graders or younger kids. I've always kind of taught adults or people who are a little bit older. So I'll say I was a little hesitant. I was a little nervous. I did not know what to expect. Mostly I was just nervous that I wouldn't have their attention, or somebody would be really difficult, and that was not the case. Not only did I have their attention, but we had some of the richest, deepest philosophical and theological conversation that you can imagine. So I'd like to share with you some of the questions that these fourth graders asked me, and maybe get into some of the conversation, how we responded, because kids do, so long as you don't condition them out of it, kids do ask the best philosophical and theological questions. It's just innate. We are meant to ask these types of questions. Unfortunately, we often get very bad answers, or people tell us these are silly questions or stupid questions, but really they're just silly people or stupid people. They're not. The questions are perfectly valid. Just because this is part of the conversation I had with somebody. I was pressing him. We were arguing over religious matters, and I pressed him on morality, and I pressed him on rights and morality and where do these things come from, and he said, "Oh, that's a silly question. That's a stupid question." I said, "No, it's not. You don't get to just call a question stupid because you've never considered it, because you can't answer it." But so often you see that's the case, and unfortunately, people with that attitude who then become parents and then tell their children that are damaging the child intellectually. These are some of the best questions that you can ask, or the types of questions that kids ask. And they typically are why questions. They're very big questions. You'll get some how in there, but you get a lot of the big why questions. And that's what I experienced in teaching Sunday school. So we have a sip of the tea, and I'll list out some of the questions that they asked me, and we'll see if we can tackle a few of these. All right, so I had 4 that I remembered. I did write them down, but I forgot where I wrote them down. What's the point of writing something down if you forget where you write something down? Okay, so the 4 questions, and a few of these came up more than once. And as an icebreaker, we started with, what's your name and your favorite food, and if you have a pet. But then we also, if you could ask God one question, what would that question be? And what an awesome question that is, by the way. I mean, especially for adults. Something I got to think of. What would my question for God be? Why did Ronnie James Dio have to go so soon? something like that. Where did he go? That's the other question. But so great. I think it's a great question. And no, I didn't come up with this question. This was provided in the curriculum, so I'm not that creative. So some of the questions they had, the most common was, why did God make us, or why did God make the universe, or why did God make the earth? Those were kind of the 3 asking all the same question. Somebody asked if God knew whether she was going to be an actress when she grew up. I thought that was very much a great question, trying to reconcile God's relationship to time and his sovereignty and his providence. Great, deep philosophical questions. We had to get a little bit into some deep Thomistic doctrine there, and we rolled out some Molinist options as well, which I understand are not always quite as popular, but I wanted to get them thinking about this. But here's the thing: is as we dove into these questions, and maybe we'll take the first one as why did God create us? That was the one that seemed most pressing on their mind, and I didn't just start to go on a ramble. I actually tried to ask them, well, why do you think God created us? Why do you think God brought us into being, or the universe into being, or anything else? And you got a few responses from some of the kids. One guy said, well, maybe God was bored. Maybe he just wanted something to do. It's funny because a lot of adults still tend to think that as well, don't they? Or maybe God was lonely. These were the 2 first ones that came up. Maybe God was bored, or maybe God was lonely. So I asked them to think about that. I said, well, is God lonely? Is God bored? What do we know about God? Is he alone? Was the first thing I asked. Is God alone? And the kids kind of looked around, looked at each other, and then a young lady spoke up and she said, no, God's not alone. I said, why is God not alone? And she said, because God's a Trinity. I'm like, wow, what a great answer. Because it's true. God isn't alone. God is relational. And so we got into that. I said, well, what does it mean to say that God is relational? And almost right away, so they said that it means that God is love. I'm like, you guys should be up on an apologetics debate stage. You're pretty amazing at this. You're pretty spectacular at this. So another kid said, well, maybe God created us because he wanted somebody to love. And I said, well, doesn't God already have somebody to love? Didn't we just say that God is relational? And I said, who's in God? And they said, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. They knew that. So these kids have been in Sunday school before. They're in the 4th grade. So it's not like they're coming in totally blind to the Catholic faith. I would argue many of them seem to have a much better understanding of it than a lot of adults do these days. So good on prep and the catechists of the New Age. They seem to be doing a nice job. So I said, okay, well, God was already in a relationship. He's already expressing this maximally great form of love. That tells us something about God. So you really think God was lonely? Do you really think God was bored? And they started to think, well, maybe not. Maybe God wasn't lonely or bored. So they think, well, then why would God want to create us? And somebody just said, well, maybe it was just an extra act of love. Maybe somebody who is love. And we started to unpack this, and we say that God is love, and you often hear this many times, and maybe you don't know where it comes from. You can get at it through philosophical arguments, like arguments of the sort of Aquinas proposed, right? When we consider change, and we can trace change all the way back to an unchanged changer, and then we can unpack what that means of how God has all the powers that we see manifest in the world. God is the ultimate power which powers everything, which of course means that he has in him, either virtually, eminently, or formally, all which we experience in the world in some capacity. Goodness, love, justice, mercy, all of these things are divine attributes. Now, I didn't kind of layer it on in that technical of a sense, but we were trying to get at this idea, okay, well, we often hear that God is love, but would it make sense that God is love if God was only one, if he was if he wasn't a Trinity? And I said, well, maybe, right? But what does that mean? We say God is love. Because we don't necessarily say God has love. We say God is love. Now, maybe somebody could have love and not be expressing it, but I think to say that God is love, we really need sort of a relational component. Don't you, children? And they all nodded, and they seemed to agree with that. And I said, well, doesn't that make sense then that God would be something like the Trinity, that he would have this eternal love relationship within himself, the three persons of the Trinity? That seems to make a lot more sense when we say or describe that God is love, that there would be that relational component. Sure, God could possess the potential for love, just like I might possess the potential for love on a deserted island, even if I don't have anybody to love. But I think we all want to say more than that about God. I think we really want to say that God is love. He's pure actuality. Is again to drive back to Aquinas and Aristotle, that he has in him there is no potential, right, waiting to be realized. It is all really. He is pure act itself. He is without potentiality. Is how we know God philosophically. So when you get out of the philosophical, the abstract, and you get into the revelation and the theology, and you see the Trinity, you see how these two really synthesize and go together. So God is love. He's a maximally great being of love. So I just thought it was really genuine and interesting and absolutely correct when somebody said that God created us from an act of love. It's a gift. It's a gift of love. So we're unpacking some deep spiritual religious truths here in like the first 10 minutes of a conversation here. This was all very important because my curriculum for these fourth graders is morality, which is sort of my philosophical specialty. I've spent more time in anything in philosophy It would be natural theology and morality, understanding arguments for God's existence, and also moral ontology and moral epistemology. So for me, what I'm trying to do when it comes to these children is get them to have a right understanding of God and to develop the right relationship with God, which is most important for making sense of morality. Because a lot of people, especially kids, can come up with this idea that morality is some arbitrary set of rules, that if you do a certain set of things, God will reward you in heaven, and if you don't do another certain set of things, then God's going to do that other thing, so you better watch out. And that's kind of that is a kind of a babyish way to think about it. Doesn't mean it's completely untrue. There's some real truth to that as well. But it's missing a huge component. And what I was just trying to build as a foundation for these children to see that God loves us. He created us from an act of love, and He only wills what is really good for us. Because when you love somebody, you will what is good for them. That is what you want for them. That is what love really means, to will the good of the other for other. Agape. That's the Christian love. So when I love my children, I will what is really good for them. I want them to flourish. Ultimately, I want them to be happy. Now, sometimes that might mean tough love. I might have to discipline them, might have to punish them. So it's not all rainbows and unicorns, but ultimately it's all from a place of love. I just so deeply love my children that I just want what is good for them. I'm a finite creature. I get it wrong. I'm not omniscient like God is. But because God is omniscient, and because He created us, He knows what is best for us. He can't not know what is best for us, and He knows what's better for us a million infinity times more. There's some fourth grade language. A million infinity times more what is really good for us, what will cause us to be most the kinds of creatures that we are, that will cause us to flourish, than we ever will. And when you understand the relationship to God, that God loves us, He wills what is good for us, then you understand where morality comes in. So we started unpacking some more, deep theological stuff here, and I said, well, why did so God created us out of an act of love, but what does it take for two persons to love each other? What is the requirement for two persons to love each other? And another young lady almost got this right away, after a few people shouted out some silly answers, of course, but choice. You need choice for love to be real. Right? And I said that's absolutely right. That's fundamentally correct. Right? Does anybody feel like if somebody who's forced into a relationship, does that sound like true love? If you're coerced into being with somebody, does that really seem like love? No, it seems like love has to be something that's chosen. If love is anything at all, it makes no sense to say that you forced somebody to love you. That just doesn't work. Love is an act of will. It's an act of assent, saying, yes, I do love you. In fact, when we think of somebody who's forced into a relationship, we often think of the exact opposite of love. So I was trying to push the matter a little further with the children. I said, okay, so if God wants to have a loving relationship with us, He had to give us choice. So what does choice mean? What did God give us so that we could make choices for ourselves? What's that word called? And they threw some things out, but nobody quite got this one. So I said, has anybody heard of the term free will? What does free will mean? And then they got it. Somebody said, well, it means the ability to choose for yourself. I said, yes, that's right, that is. Now, why would God give us free will? They said, for love. So none of this stuff is all that complicated. It's really not. Like, these fourth graders got it, and they were interested, which was so cool. Okay, so God wants a love relationship with us. He gave us free will to make that possibility a reality. But what's the risk there? What's the danger in giving us free will? And again, I'll tell you, these kids are smart. They got it right away. And there's this one girl in the class who's particularly bright. I got to talk to her and encourage her to go into philosophy and theology. She's just got such a beautiful mind for it. And she said, well, the risk is that people can choose to do bad things. And that's absolutely right. They can risk to do bad things. So I said, well, this is kind of a funny thing to think about, isn't it? Because God, on the one hand, wills something. He wants us to have a loving relationship with Him. But in order for that to happen, He has to allow for another thing, which is the free choice. But as soon as He allows for free choice, there's the possibility that somebody might choose not to have a loving relationship with God. And I said, that's a really interesting thing to think about, because it actually seems like it puts God in somewhat of a dilemma. Now, we don't usually think of God as someone who can't do something. But here, I think we have an instance of where there is something that even God cannot do, in the sense that God cannot force a free creature to choose a certain something. That is a logical contradiction. You can't say that you force somebody to freely choose something, because then it isn't a free choice. So if God wanted us to be able to freely choose a relationship with Him, to make possible the reality of love in the greatest conceivable sense, then He had to take a risk. He had to take a risk. He had to allow us to choose not God and not a relationship. And with free will comes the possibility of the abuse of free will, comes the possibility of choosing wrongly, of choosing other than what is really good for us. And that's the point where morality starts to kick in, right? So because we are free agents, and because God created us, there are some things that are really good for us. Now, the thing that is best for us, above anything else, is a loving, saving relationship with God through His only begotten Son, Jesus Christ. That is our highest good in life. That is our highest aim. That is what God wills more than anything. Okay, that's the best thing for us. But we can choose not to have that. We can choose many things that are not good for us. So aside from God as being our highest good, there's many other things that are good for us, that cause us to flourish in many ways. We can take some basic examples. Being mindful of what we eat, not overeating or not eating too little, or not spending too much time sedentary, making sure we're taking exercise. These are all things that are really objectively good for us. Yet we can choose not to follow them. We can choose to ignore them. We can choose to overeat, to live a life that is extremely sedentary and unhealthy. We can choose to dabble in substances, to become addicted, right? So sometimes our desires can become very perverted. We can desire things that are really not good for us. Right? And this is now with the conversation of the kids, where morality starts to make a lot more sense. So rather than thinking of morality as some type of arbitrary set of rules of, hey, do this and you'll get really good things later on, and don't do this because if you don't, oh boy, you're going to regret it. Again, some deep truth to that. Don't get me wrong. I'm not denying heaven and hell here, but there's more to it than that. Much more to it. Rather, what we should think about is morality is a set of instructions. It's a blueprint for us to get the most out of being the types of creatures that we are. It's a user's manual, if you will, for human flourishing and happiness, both proximate happiness here in this life and ultimate happiness in the next. So Aquinas was helpful in this in his work, where he said, we have the virtues, and following those virtues, both the cardinal virtues and the theological virtues, helps us to find a sort of imperfect happiness here on earth. Because Aquinas rightfully understood that perfect happiness is reserved for heaven. That is where our desire for the transcendent will be completely fulfilled. But here on earth, that doesn't mean we can't still be more or less happy. We can be. And that's why we have the moral law. And this is why we have conscience. This is why God gave us the commandments, why Jesus reiterated the commandments, gave us the two most high and holy commandments, and the Beatitudes. He's giving us instructions, not just to gain reward and to avoid punishment, but to make the most of our lives and to be as happy as we possibly can here on earth. So they're helping us to come in line with God's will. That's what morality is about. Morality done right should help us come in line with God's will. And we should want that. And the reason we should want that is because God knows what is really good for us. But we can often get confused. We're finite creatures. We're mired in sin. We often desire things that are not really good for us. We often desire things that are immediately gratifying. We have these concupiscible appetites. We make bad decisions. We can fall into habitual vice, conform to social conditioning and peer pressure, and just do things that lead us away from God, that lead us away from a relationship with God, that lead us further into sin, further into confusion, further into darkness, and further into unhappiness, much in unhappiness. St. Augustine had it right. Lord, you made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. I mean, there's a reason that is quoted so much. Because it's true. It's just true. It's just right. And anybody who's gone, as I have, on the hunt for meaning in life without focusing fully and finally on God, you're going to realize what Augustine did. You're just not going to find the happiness you're looking for outside of a relationship with God. So that's the way to look at morality. That's the best way to look at it. So that was a stage I tried to set for the children, and they seem to really get it, and they seem to be really interested in it, which makes me so excited. I mean, I see this as a moral obligation. As soon as they ask me to do this, I'm like, yeah, 1,000,000%. If I can have the chance to solidify the faith of these children and to just show them the truth of it and to give them a solid defense and presentation and an attractive but honest presentation of this is right, you are in the right spot, and challenge them too. Religious studies, philosophy, theology, these should be rigorous subjects. I think the biggest failing and part of the reason I fell away from the church and God for so long before I eventually, by His grace, returned, was that I was given the stock caricatures and the babyish formulas of the faith that just didn't stand up to any type of scrutiny, and that's what it's one thing to complain about it. I'm in there trying to fix it, so I'm trying to give these children the best presentation I can and make it as engaging and rigorous as I can. And I want them to have the right mindset when it comes to things like the commandments and morality and sin and redemption, and to understand more than anything that God loves them. God loves all of us, and all that God wants is for us to have our highest good, to have our perfect happiness, which by design He made to be had in a relationship with Him. God is our source of perfect happiness. Now, we might not realize that now, and the details of what that might exactly look like in the world to come is that, we don't need to know all those now, but we can trust God and His omniscience and His promise that it's going to be good. It's going to be really, really good, better than anything here on earth. I know Peter Kreeft, the philosopher, once said, like kids asked him, the typical question, hey, when we get to heaven, will we still be able to have candy or have sex? Or some adult asked him, I think that's the story, will we be able to have sex in heaven? He's like, it's like a kid asking if they can have candy when they start having sex. Trust me, when you're in heaven, sex is going to be the last thing you're thinking about. I think that's a good attitude to maintain, right? God knows what's going to make us perfectly happy. We don't need to question Him on that, as we shouldn't question God on just about anything. So, interesting conversation so far. Are we enjoying this? I hope you're getting something out of it. I just had such a delight talking to the children about Catholic morality, and I think we can go a little bit further. I did promise on a previous conversation that I would begin to explore natural law theory. I've been getting a lot of questions about that. I've been talking about this on my Sunday school podcast a little bit, also on my Pat Flynn Show podcast, and with a lot of people. I am, as you know, the Catholic Church has always been the sort of vanguard of natural law, which is, what is natural law? Well, it's a proximate way of figuring out morality. And what do we mean by proximate? Meaning we can start to figure out what is good, what is bad, what is right and wrong by just deep armchair thinking alone. Meaning we don't need to go and point directly to a Bible or the Ten Commandments or this or that. Now, the proximate needs to be supported ultimately by the ultimate. Okay, natural law only makes sense in a teleological universe, in a universe that is designed and designed by God. But because the universe is designed by God, and because we live in that universe, we can think deeply about it. And when we think deeply about it, we can realize that things in this universe tend to have certain intentions, aims, directedness, or as Aristotle would say, final causality. And this is sort of the building blocks for natural law. What is final causality? Let's give a quick rundown of this. Well, Aristotle said that to understand a thing, you need to know its four causes. And its four causes would be the efficient cause, the material cause, the formal cause, and the final cause. Now, the efficient and material cause we're fairly familiar with through the enterprise of science. These are looking at the stuff that something is made of, that's a material cause, and who or what brought that stuff into its current existence or configuration. Now, a formal cause is the essence of something or the configuration that it's in. Okay, what makes this thing the type of thing that it is? That's what we're talking about when we talk about formal cause. The word configuration is a helpful word for thinking about that, and we'll give some examples here in a minute. What is the essence of this thing? Final cause. What is this thing for? What is it aimed at? What is its purpose? What is it trying to achieve? Okay. Now, why are these four causes important? Now here's the first thing. Science abstracts away from formal and final causes. Science has nothing to say about these things. These aren't things that can be modeled mathematically. So we shouldn't be surprised when we don't hear anything about formal or final causes in science. These are philosophical and theological considerations. And when we talk about things formal and final cause, these two things really go together, right? You can't really have one without the other. I would argue you need to have all four causes. Obviously, so would Aristotle. He said to really understand a thing, to know what a thing is about, we need to understand all four causes. But sometimes you'll hear people agitate for formal causes, or for final causes and teleology without formal causes. And I would just suggest that those two really aren't something you can separate. So let's just take an example here, just to get the juices flowing and to see how we can start to pull morality out of this type of teleological thinking. And again, when we say teleological, telos, we're talking about directedness or aim or design, purpose in nature. And the whole idea here is once you understand what something is for, you can then understand what is better or worse for that something, in the sense that anything that helps that something to achieve its final cause, that helps that something to be the type of thing that it is good for that thing. Anything that frustrates that thing's final cause, that impedes that thing from being the type of thing that it is bad for that thing. So the key thing to understand here is that fact and value are no longer separated. When you understand the facts about something through natural law, value is just part of those facts, right? They're inseparable. Now, why is this important? Well, it helps us to get around, I would say, by not causing the problem to begin with, of the famous naturalistic fallacy, or the is-ought gap. And many Enlightenment-style philosophies suffer from this because they describe what something is. They don't necessarily describe that it ought to be a certain way. But natural law theory doesn't have this problem because the oughtness is built directly into the facts about something. When you understand something's four causes, you understand what that thing ought to do because you're understanding the way it is supposed to be through its directedness or its teleology. So fact and value are just really one and the same in this worldview. We don't have to worry about the is-ought gap because we're seeing things correctly, that it's all in there. So I think that to me was very, very attractive when I first started studying rational. There's many things that were attractive about natural law theory to me, but that was one because when you look at Kantian ethics or utilitarianism or many other moral systems, you can never really cross that is-ought gap. But natural law theory, it isn't a problem. It's built into the system. And I would so far argue that in any worldview that is not teleological, you will never be able to bridge the is-ought gap. You will never be able to get a system of morality off the ground. We need teleology to have morality. We need to be able to say that certain things are directed towards other ends in order to make any type of value judgment about what is better or worse for that thing. It's only if we have that design, that directedness, that purpose, that we can then make sense of what a thing ought to do, or what a person ought to do, or what is good for a thing, or bad for a thing, or right or wrong. Now again, ultimately this is all going to come out of a theistic viewpoint. And obviously Aristotle wasn't a Christian. One hopes that if he were born in a different era, he probably would have been. So you can get natural law theory, I think, up and working in a general theistic viewpoint. But ultimately, we are going to need to rely on that transcendent anchor point to support all of this. But we can figure it out approximately just by understanding these four causes. Let's take a triangle. This is an easy example to start with. What is the form of a triangle? What is triangularity as such? Okay, so I'm trying to get at the formal cause. Like, what makes a triangle a triangle? What makes it the type of thing that it is? Well, it seems like a triangle is, triangularity is that which has three straight sides whose angles add up to 180 degrees. Anything that has three straight sides whose angles add up to 100 degrees would be an instance of a triangle. So it's what's common to all triangles, right? So it doesn't matter if that triangle is red or black, or if it's big or small, or if it's drawn on a chalkboard or a piece of paper. If something is a triangle, it has three straight sides that add up to 180 degrees. But we're abstracting away that essence, which is triangularity, common to all triangles. It's the configuration we're talking about that makes a triangle a triangle. Now, understanding the facts about its formal cause, we also start to understand its final cause. A triangle is just supposed to be that which has three straight sides that add up to 180 degrees. So we can make value judgments based on the facts or the formal causality, which ties into the final causality of a triangle. So if I'm drawing a triangle with a really shaky hand and it doesn't have perfectly straight lines, it's actually got somewhat curvy lines, and I say, here's a triangle, you would say, well, that's not a very good triangle, those aren't very straight lines. You would be right in your value adjustment. If you were to say that's a bad triangle, you would be right. I wouldn't say, you're committing the is-ought fallacy there, just because that's what a triangle is. Just to understand what a triangle is supposed to be, you understand how you ought to draw a triangle. And you have a sort of reference guide for what makes a triangle better or worse. To the extent that we have an instance, right, where triangularity is instantiated rather than abstracted, to the extent we have an instance, a triangle that gets closer to this ideal, to this formal cause of having three straight lines of angles that add up to 180 degrees, we have a better triangle. This is a better triangle than the triangle whose lines were sloppily drawn and angles a little curvy or whatever. Okay, so again, nothing crazy here. This should all be fairly common sense. And when I present this to people, they mostly nod their head. Great. Now, triangles aren't moral agents, but it's a good example to start with just to get the idea of this, in our mind. So then if I draw the triangle on the paper, we can then have an efficient cause, which would be me. I drew the triangle, and a material cause, which would be the paper and the ink that the triangle is made out of. So then we have, we kind of complete the picture there. But let's take like an animal. Okay, let's take like, and certain things can have multiple, multiple ends. It doesn't say that one thing just has one end. Certain things have multiple ends. So, for example, part of the teleology of a female dog is to nurse her pups. Right? When we understand a dog and its formal cause and its final cause, we can quickly get to understand that, okay, part of what this dog is supposed to do by its very nature is propagate and nurse its young. So to the extent that we have a dog that doesn't nurse its young, we would say that's a worse dog. That's a worse dog than a dog that does nurse its young and propagate, that is fulfilling its teleology. This other dog has had its final cause frustrated. Its instantiation is somehow worse off than it could be. Who knows why that is? Maybe it's got a genetic defect, or maybe it was in a serious accident, or whatever. But let's say it's an accident. The dog got in an accident. We would say that accident was bad for the dog. It was bad for the dog because it frustrated the dog's final cause, part of its final causality, its teleology, to propagate and nurse children and raise children and such. Okay? With me so far? So just when you understand what a thing is through this sort of Aristotelian Thomistic natural law, old natural law theory or classic natural law theory, there is a new natural law theory which I'm not really at all on board with. The classic natural law theory, when you understand the facts about something, you understand what that something is for, and then you can start to figure out what is good for that something, what is bad for that something, and these are objective. Okay, it's not a matter of preference, right? It's a badly drawn triangle is an objective fact. A triangle that is closer to having 3 straight sides with 180 degrees is objectively better than a triangle that's drawn with a really shaky hand on a school bus on the back of a backpack. It's just a bad triangle, objectively. It has nothing to do with somebody's preference. Okay? And that's really important because so many people will want to try and make morality out as a matter of preference. It's believe me, it ain't. And the same thing of how dare you tell me how to live? I'll decide what will make me happy. Actually, you won't, friend. You might be able to deceive yourself for a while, but there are some things in life that are really good for you, some things that will actually really attribute to your happiness. And there are some things in life that are really bad for you that will not attribute to your happiness, right? So somebody who is addicted to drugs, for example, and sometimes you just got to take the extreme example just to really drive the point home. Like, they might think that doing these drugs makes them happy, or that avoiding withdrawal makes them happy. But no sane person would agree that drug addict is making it the right decision for themselves. No sane person says, you know what, it makes them happy, so who am I to judge? What a stupid thing to say. What a dumb thing that would be to say. But yet people say it all the time. They say it all the time. Either morality is objective and it drives all the way through, or it doesn't. If you want to say that, to each his own, you better be willing to say that for the most perverse activities all the way through. And nobody is, because people get this. They understand that morality is objective, that some things really just are better or worse than other things. Certain behaviors, certain patterns of thought, certain actions, and so on and so forth. The only time they tend to rebel against it is when it comes down to their own personal choices. And we all do this. And look, and this is how you know you're following morality wrong. If you've got a moral system that doesn't challenge you, I would say you're following morality wrong if you're just not living the Catholic moral life. I mean, that's the simple answer. That's the short answer. But we can draw it out a little bit more philosophically, because I think, we're all prone, in some instances or not, to make decisions that just aren't that good for us. So if you pick up and get on with natural law theory or Catholic morality, you will be challenged. You will be asked to realign certain desires with what is really good for you. And you might be desiring many things that just aren't that good for you right now. So morality is an exercise. It's a challenge. The virtues are a habit. They are a discipline. Discipline is a virtue. Temperance, fortitude. Oh, there's so much to unpack here. But the whole point of natural law is showing like, look, when you understand the facts about something, all the facts that are actually there and relevant, not just the scientific facts, but the complete facts of something's essence and nature, then fact and value are just one in the same. Like, it's a bundle deal, folks. You cannot escape it. And this applies right on down through to the level of morality and human agents. So again, we don't say that the dog is doing a morally wrong thing when she feeds her pups, because one, it might have been beyond her control, but two, a dog is not a moral agent. A dog can't grasp abstract concepts. A dog can't look at a tree and be like, oh, that tree is an oak. No, dogs can't do that. Dogs are morons. And I mean, people are like, that's really mean to say. All other animals are morons. They're not rational. What makes humans, what is our formal cause, right? What did Aristotle say we are? We are rational animals. That is what is uniquely human. We can grasp abstract concepts. We can tell the difference between boy eats dog and dog eats boy. No animal could tell the difference between those two sentences conceptually. It's impossible. That's part of what makes us really special. Now, animals, God bless them, you love them, but they don't have the same intellectual capacities that we do. They are non-rational animals. But because we're rational animals, we then have autonomy, and this is where morality comes into play. Morality does not apply to a falcon or that kills a fish, for example. And that's why we say the falcon kills the fish. We don't say the falcon murders the fish. But a human might murder another human. They might also kill another human, depends on the act, but they very well might murder another human, because humans are moral agents. We have autonomy, at least in most instances we do. We can think of instances where our autonomy is somehow overruled. And this is, again, a question that's often considered in moral philosophy and ethics classes of, what do we need to say that the person was autonomous in each and every situation? Not necessarily right now. Most of the time people have autonomy. For example, somebody is really deep into addiction. They might not be considered fully autonomous. So humans are rational agents. We can deliberate. We can choose. We can make decisions freely for ourselves. This gives us that opportunity to either grow morally or degrade morally. Right. And this is where we got to take a look again at the kind of aim or the end of humanity. So what is reason for? Why do we have reason and rationality? Well, Aristotle and eventually Aquinas would argue is to know God, to know and to come into a loving, say, relationship with God. The point of reason is to discern truth. The highest truth is God. That is the truth of our happiness. That is where reason is supposed to get us, right? So reason is for discerning truth. That is the natural end of reason. So anything that we do that impedes our free seeking of truth and happiness through our act of reason is bad for us, right? Reason should seek what is really good for the person. So to the extent that we choose things that are really not good for us, that do not help us come closer to truth and happiness and knowing and loving God, we are frustrating our own final cause. But we can also frustrate other people's final cause, right? If people are free agents, they're free moral agents with reason, and they are meant to freely determine their own loving, saving, truthful relationship with God. If I then go and enslave a person, that's wrong. I am frustrating their final cause. I am frustrating their freedom, their rational freedom to flourish as the kinds of creatures that they are. That is an immoral act on my behalf. Now, so as if anybody need to be reminded of one reason why slavery is bad. But this is how we can support that morally in a very deep and profound way. If somebody commits murder or kills somebody, that's like the ultimate frustration of somebody's. You couldn't more frustrate somebody than doing something like that. So there's degrees here. There's gradations, of course. If some things are obviously more frustrating than others, but that which tends to promote our good or our final cause is good for us, and the decisions that we make that promote that for ourselves and others are good moral decisions. The decisions we make that frustrate our final cause and ourselves and others are bad moral decisions. So we have right moral decisions, we have rightness, and we have wrong moral decisions, which are wrongness, all falling out of natural law theory. So that's one way to start to think about it, one way to get at it, and it's a very brief excursus, if you will, but I hope it makes sense. And you don't need all that much groundwork. Now, look, it gets very in depth. We could spend years talking about this. It's a rich study. It's an extremely rewarding study. But just to get the basic gist of it, isn't that difficult. It isn't that complicated. But when you understand the natural ends and causes of things, you then understand why things like contraception are immoral, things like same-sex marriage don't make sense, because you start to understand, well, what is the final cause of the sexual organs? Well, one is supposed to go with another type of sexual organ. When you start to think about the cause of human relationships, why they are inherently supposed to be heterosexual and both unitive and procreative. Again, all of this comes out of natural law theory. Clearly, abortion is an abomination, if anybody needs to be reminded of that. So we can support all of this rationally and proximately through natural law. We don't have to just go point to the Bible or the Catechism or say God says so. Now, we can develop a fully rational, rigorous philosophical argument for why these certain things are right and these certain things are wrong. Now, ultimately, it needs to be supported by God. It needs a teleological view of the world. But here's the trap that people will get in. If you accept the teleological view of the world, you have to accept these implications. There's really no way around them. You essentially just have to accept Catholic morality. If you deny the teleological view of the world, then you tear down the entire structure that's needed for morality to begin with. You will never get past the is-ought gap, meaning you will never be able to get a moral or ethical system up and working. See, God's not a fool. God knows what he's doing. Right? You're not going to outsmart God. He knew how to design things that we could not, just invent our own morality. People still try, but they can't support it intellectually. You need teleology for morality. But if you accept that and you follow it through, you're going to get Catholic morality. If you deny it, you tear down the whole moral system. It's only because most people are operating on the very tip of the iceberg and they haven't considered these deeper moral questions that they can kind of hodgepodge a moral system for themselves. Well, I'm nice to people, and I give money occasionally, this or that. It's like, okay, that's all well and good, but you never really considered the moral questions. What is morality? Where is it grounded ontologically? Is morality objective? Is it valid and binding, independent of human opinion? If so, then how do we do that? Right? Where does that validity and bindingness come from? How do you explain moral values and obligations? What would give us an obligation, right? And obviously, the short answer to this is if you want a sufficient grounds for moral ontology and objective morality, it ultimately has to be in God. No atheistic picture is ever going to give you anything like that. Oh, Lord knows we need to have that conversation again. But moving beyond that, you have moral epistemology. Okay, morality is definitely objective. It's real, folks. Now, how do I start to figure out what is right and wrong, good or bad? Well, that's where we have revelation. We have the traditions and teachings of the Catholic Church. We have the Ten Commandments. We have the Beatitudes. But then we also have the cardinal virtues, the theological virtues, and natural law theory. Each one supportive and enhancing of the others, in my view. So that's kind of where I tend to fall on it. I think there's richness and depth to all of these. They all support each other. They all enhance each other. Nothing, of course, goes above and beyond the commandments that Jesus himself directly gave us to. But, when you're dialoguing with people, they might not all be receptive to what Jesus had to say, so you need to have a philosophical argument with them. And that's where understanding teleology, natural law theory, moral ontology, moral epistemology really comes in handy. And this comes in handy because once you understand this stuff, you will never lose an argument again. And the reason you will never lose an argument again is because every single argument is a moral argument on some level. You have to hit the Y button enough times, I call it. If you spam the Y button on somebody's position on anything, their position on fitness, sports, politics, you'll eventually get to some moral bedrock that they probably have never considered, some moral foundation that they have never justified or really thought about ever. And that's where you can get them. You can show that their moral foundations are flimsy and absurd most of the time, and you can then present a lot of the stuff that I've presented here to make the case for Christ, to make the case for Catholicism, and make the case for a truly right or wrong, and how to figure out what is truly right or wrong, and battle against this sick culture of relativism and postmodernism and pockets of nihilism here or there. It really is a fascinating and disgusting time that we live in. But hey, look, there's hope, folks. Christ gave us a church. It will always prevail. It just needs people like you. Get out there, spread the message, understand this stuff. Just, again, get that the Catholic position just is the intellectual position. There's no alternative. Have that confidence, have that faith. I hope you found this episode interesting, enjoyable, thought-provoking. If you like it, let me know. We'll have more discussions like this one. All right, folks. Talk soon.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.